Ever wondered about the world of 3D printing? From choosing your printer to completing your first print, we've got you covered. Stick around to discover what really matters, that way you can print like a pro. By the end of this video, you'll have everything you need to bring your imagination to life through 3D printing. So, what is 3D printing? Well, there are actually two different types. There is resin printing, which typically uses ultraviolet light to solidify layers of liquid resin, and then there's fused deposition modeling, or FDM printing. This method extrudes material from a spool to build your creation layer by layer. For the purposes of today's video, we're going to be focusing on the much more popular FDM printing. Now, the first step in your journey is to buy a 3D printer. And luckily, there are printers for any budget out there, from $150 to a couple thousand. When looking for a 3D printer, I recommend considering the 3 Bs. Build volume, brand, and bells and whistles. The build volume determines how large of objects you can actually print in the X, Y, or Z axis. It can range from 100 millimeters cubed to 400 plus millimeters. As far as brand goes, you do want to pick a brand that is well known. However, there are a variety of options to choose from. There's Bambu Labs, which is an innovative startup. There's Prusa Research, which is a well-known engineering-focused brand. And then there's a variety of other relatively cheaper brands, like Ender, that is more suited for those who like to tinker with their machine. Elegoo, like the machine that I have back here now, the Neptune 3 Pro, and a variety of other brands. Just make sure to check the reviews. And then there are the bells and whistles, which is the variety of technology that can come with your 3D printer at your price point. The one technology that I recommend as a must is automatic bed leveling. Otherwise, you'll have to level your bed manually, and that can take a lot of time and is prone to error. I also recommend that your 3D printer has to have a heated bed. That helps with adhesion, so that way you can print large prints like behind me. The last thing that I'd pay attention to is having a maximum nozzle temperature of at least 260 degrees, so that way you can print the most common materials. Now that you have your 3D printer set up at home, let's get to know it. Firstly, there is the bed. This is the flat portion that your printer prints onto. Next is the hot end, which is a combination of parts that takes the filament, heats it up, and extrudes it through the nozzle. Next is the gantry, which supports lateral and vertical movement. You can also find the power supply in the back or side of your machine. Just make sure to follow the instruction manual to ensure proper voltage for your country. There is also usually an SD card slot for transferring files and printing them. Lastly, your machine usually has a spool holder for filament at the top. I've mentioned filament a few times, so let's dive into that. There are dozens of types of filament out there, but for beginners, I recommend 3. The first is PLA. This is the easiest to print material, but is relatively rigid and a little weak. Next is PETG, which is a little harder to print, but it is stronger and UV resistant, so useful for a lot of applications. Lastly, after you've mastered printing PLA and PETG, you can move on to TPU. This is a flexible filament, so it's harder to print, but it has a lot of very cool use cases. There are also many other exotic materials out there that use carbon fiber, nylon, wood shavings, you name it. But for me, I would stick with those 3 as a beginner until you master those. My recommendation is definitely to start off with just PLA, and once you're comfortable there, move on to the others. Now, you have a 3D printer, you have your filament, what are you gonna do with it? You need to find a model to print. The easiest way to do this is to find a model online. There are databases with thousands of models free to use. My 2 favorites are Printables, which has a reward system for posting reviews and makes of other people's models, and also Thangs, which searches the database of lots of other websites to find you the perfect model you need. In either case, you're going to be looking to download an STL file. We'll talk more about STL files and how to use them in just a minute. Now, the other option is to use CAD or computer-aided design to create your own models. My 2 recommendations here are number 1, Tinkercad, for those who have no experience, are beginners, and just want to go. This is the easiest to learn and it's very intuitive. But if you want something a little bit more advanced, I'd recommend OnShape, which is a free browser-based CAD software. You don't need to download anything, and there's lots of tutorials online. Now that you've either created your own model or downloaded it, you're gonna take that STL and input it into a slicer. What's a slicer, you might ask? Slicers take your model and turn it into a series of layers so that way your 3D printer can understand it. This is a software you're going to have to download, but there are 2 recommendations that I have. The first is Orca Slicer, which is an open source, constantly improved slicer software that you can download off GitHub. However, if you want something more tested and true that is not open source, I would point you towards Prusa Slicer. Both are great options. Within your slicer, there are hundreds of settings for you to play around with, such as infill, temperature, supports, and anything you might need to make the model of your dreams. For your first time, I'd recommend using the default profile in your slicer for the material that you chose, such as PLA. Over time, you can run a variety of tests to perfect your settings to exactly what you want. The export from your slicer will be a G-code file. This is the file that your printer can actually understand. You're going to take this file and put it on an SD card or print it over the web to your printer, depending on which printer you chose. But wait, before you print, there are a few steps you need to do first. Firstly, you need to make sure that your machine is leveled. Hopefully you bought a machine with automatic leveling, so it just takes a click of a button. Next, you're going to set your Z offset, which is the distance from the nozzle to your bed. Generally, you want about the width of one piece of paper, with a little bit of friction as you pull back. That rule of thumb is for PLA, but for PETG, TPU, and other materials, the Z offset can change, and it's usually a little bit larger. Next, you're going to preheat your nozzle and then insert your filament. If you do have a filament guide, you're going to want to put it through that so that way you know if you ever run out. Lastly, insert your SD card and hit print. The next step is to sit back and wait patiently. Sometimes these things can take hours, or if you're making something really big, even days. But once your masterpiece is created, I recommend waiting just a little bit longer for your bed to completely cool off. And make sure never to touch the build plate or the nozzle when it's hot. Once everything has cooled down, you should be able to easily remove your object from the build plate. If you do end up having to use a scraper, make sure that it's a plastic one. Never use metal on your build plate. And voila! You've made your first masterpiece with just a few steps and a little bit of knowledge. I've tried to cover all the basics in this video, but there are 3 other resources that I'd recommend. Number 1 is YouTube. There are lots of videos like this that go even further into depth to make sure that you can become an expert in whatever type of material or whatever type of product you want to create. There are also a lot of other free websites out there like all3dp.com, which have great articles exclusively about 3D printing. Lastly, join a Reddit group like r/3D printing or the subreddit for your printer specifically. There are thousands of people just like you starting their 3D printing journey. With newfound knowledge on your side, you're ready to unleash your creativity like never before with 3D printing. Time is our most precious resource, so I really appreciate you spending some of it with me. If you learned something in this video, feel free to like and subscribe. If you want, you can also leave a comment so that way I know what videos to make next. Please join me in continuing your learning journey with the video on screen now. I'll see you in the next one.